Alright folks, let's go over what you need to study for your unit test on bacteria, archaea, and protists. We have two sets of foldable notes for this unit. We have our bacteria and archaea foldable, the one with lots of flaps. We have our protist foldable, and in addition to that, you might find this notes chart from the classification unit rather helpful because as it puts each kingdom of life side by side with the others for cell structure, number of cells, how it gets its energy, etc. The three to focus on for this unit test are archaea, bacteria, and protista. In your labs and projects section, you have your archaea, bacteria, and protist introductory web quest, as well as your review day lab sheet that has some computer activities, some vocabulary review, and then space to draw what you saw under the microscope. And as always, you have your unit portfolio and your glossary. Additional resources are available on my Phoenix page. Simply log in and click on the tab, What Do I Need to Study, to find full versions of our class presentations and blank foldables should you need to print out some more. You can also find your glossaries there should you need to print out a new copy. Review games and other helpful links are posted under the tab Review Games, and you can find the link for this and other videos under the tab Miss E's Videos. So let's start with bacteria. Bacteria are a kingdom in the domain Bacteria. They are prokaryotic, meaning that their cells do not have a nucleus and do not have membrane-bound organelles. And they are always unicellular, meaning that they consist of only one cell. Depending on the species, bacteria can be heterotrophic, meaning that they must consume other organisms for energy, or autotrophic, meaning that they can produce their own food. Our autotrophic bacteria are also known as producers, while our heterotrophic bacteria take on the roles of consumers and decomposers. The bacteria that are producers, such as cyanobacteria, believed to be the precursors to plants, perform photosynthesis, which means to make energy using light. Bacteria come in three shapes. Rod-like bacteria are called bacilli. Berry-shaped or round-shaped bacteria are called cocci, and spiral-shaped bacteria are called spirilla. The shape of bacteria that are in yogurt, that's bacilli. The shape of bacteria that get you sick if you have strep throat, that's cocci. And the shape of bacteria that causes the disease Lyme disease, which is spread by tick bites, is spirilla. Bacteria can have positive, negative, and neutral relationships with humans. On the positive side, bacteria can be used to create medicines and foods, such as yogurt. On the neutral side, we have many bacteria that live in and on our bodies that don't bother us very much. In fact, many of them help us with our immune system, making them another positive relationship. But bacteria can turn on us and make us sick at times. If you eat questionable leftovers that have been in the fridge a little bit too long, you might get really sick with food poisoning. Another negative to bacteria is when we overuse substances such as hand sanitizers or antibiotics. Overusing these substances creates what are called superbugs or drug-resistant bacteria. By killing off bacteria by overusing hand sanitizers and antibiotics, that eliminates the competition for stronger mutants of these different kinds of bacteria. Superbugs, not good. Our next topic are archaebacteria, also known as archaea, found in the domain Archaea. Archaea are among the oldest organisms on Earth and are called extremophiles because they can handle very extreme environments in which other organisms would struggle to live. Like bacteria, archaea are unicellular prokaryotes, one-celled organisms that lack a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. They can also be autotrophic or heterotrophic, taking on the roles of consumers, producers, and decomposers. The archaea that are producers, or autotrophs, can produce their food through a process called chemosynthesis, which means making food using chemicals. These organisms actually eat atoms of iron and molecules of chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide in thermic vents to get their energy. We learned about three major groups of archaea: methanogens, thermophiles, and halophiles. Methanogens live in swamps and other places with very little to no oxygen. In fact, oxygen is toxic to them. As part of their metabolism, they give off the gas methane. They can be used by humans in sewage treatment plants. Thermophiles live where it is very, very hot. They can survive in environments where other organisms would most certainly perish, such as where temperatures are far above the temperature at which water boils. Halophiles live in incredibly salty or briny environments. They can live places such as the Dead Sea or the Great Salt Lake, where other organisms would struggle to survive. And for those of you who are curious, because I had many questions about this, psychrophiles are archaea that can live in extremely cold temperatures. Archaea are awesome because not only are they like living fossils in that they're among the oldest organisms on Earth, but they can give us a lot of insight to what Earth was like when the planet was first beginning. Beyond that, because they can live in such extreme environments, it has been suggested by some scientists that Archaea might possibly be a link to life on other planets. If they can survive where there's no oxygen, or tons of salt, or intense heat, or bitter, bitter cold, perhaps they could survive on other planets. Bacteria and archaea both reproduce asexually, meaning that they don't need a partner to create the next generation. They reproduce by way of a process called binary fission, which means splitting into two. One cell will double its genetic material and eventually split into two identical cells. This allows both bacteria and archaea to reproduce very quickly. This makes them excellent test subjects for scientific research, but also explains how you can feel so great at the start of the day and so crummy by the end of the day if you catch something like the stomach flu or strep throat. That's because bacteria can reproduce very quickly in your body and make you sick. And now, what is increasingly becoming my favorite kingdom of life on Earth, the protists. Protists are in the kingdom Protista, in the domain Eukarya. They are the first organisms that we have really learned about this year that are eukaryotic. This means that their cells have true nuclei and membrane-bound organelles. Protists can perhaps be best defined by what they are not. They are not animals, they are not plants, they are not fungi, and for a long time they are often miscategorized into these groups. Today, we know that they have their own kingdom called the kingdom Protista. Although some protists have characteristics that make them seem similar to animals, and others have characteristics that make them seem similar to plants, and others still have characteristics that make them seem similar to fungi, they are members of none of these kingdoms. However, we are going to dig a little deeper and appreciate all of the uniqueness that is the kingdom Protista. Protists are incredibly diverse. They can be autotrophs, they can be heterotrophs, they can be multicellular, or they can be unicellular. They can reproduce sexually, or they can reproduce asexually. It really depends on the species that you're talking about. They can also take on all major ecological roles: producers, consumers, and decomposers. Autotrophic producing protists use photosynthesis. And in fact, photosynthetic algae, which are protists, not plants, make most of Earth's oxygen. So if you're breathing right now, you should thank a protist. We can think of the phyla, which is plural of phylum, of Protista as fitting into three broad categories: fungus-like protists, plant-like protists, and animal-like protists. Let's start by talking about fungus-like protists. We talked about two main groups of fungus-like protists: slime molds, which like to live in cool, damp areas, such as the woods, and water molds, which can grow almost anywhere that's cool and damp, but are especially prevalent in aquatic environments. Just like fungi, fungus-like protists grow on what they eat. And perhaps one of the most famous fungus-like protists is the one that caused the Great Potato Famine in Ireland. That was a water mold. Next up, we have the plant-like protists. We have 6 different phyla of plant-like protists. The first 3 are all kinds of algae, also known as kelp or seaweed. Brown algae grows in colder waters, red algae grows in tropical environments, and green algae, the most diverse phylum of our plant-like protists, can grow almost anywhere. If you've walked by Mercer Pond recently, you've probably seen some green algae floating on the surface. In addition to our 3 colors of algae, we also have dinoflagellates, photosynthetic organisms that often have 2 flagella that help them move, and are the organisms on which we can blame red tides. Diatoms, beautifully complex complex, single-celled organisms that have cell walls made of cellulose and silica, which is the same chemical as glass. If you've ever walked on sand barefoot, you have walked across diatom shells. And euglenoids, our most complex plant-like protists. These can switch between being autotrophs and heterotrophs. They have an eye spot that allows them to detect light so that they can swim towards a light source and photosynthesize, or alternatively, they can chase after food particles. Pretty cool. And last but certainly not least, we have 4 main phyla of animal-like protists. Our flagellates use flagella, which we've also seen in some plant-like protists like euglenoids and some species of bacteria. Flagella are whip-like tails that help an organism move. Many of the flagellate protists that we have studied and talked about are parasites, meaning that they take over another organism called the host and wreak havoc on their body. We also talked about ciliate protists. Ciliate protists are more complex. Their bodies are covered in hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny little hairs called cilia, which comes from the Latin word for eyelashes. These little cilia help the organisms propel themselves through the water and get food into their gullet, which is like a mouth if you're a single-celled organism. Amoeba-like protists use a pseudopod or a false foot to help them get around. They extend out part of their cell membrane and then catch up the rest of their body. It's kind of like when you're taking steps down the street. You stick your foot out first and then the rest of your body catches up with you. However, amoeba and amoeba-like protists don't have feet, so they use a pseudopod. And our last category of animal-like protists would be the spore-producing protists. These are always parasitic, which means that they cannot move on their own. They are parasites that invade their host and wreak havoc on their bodies. Perhaps the most famous spore-producing protist is Plasmodium, which causes malaria and is spread by mosquitoes. So now let's compare and contrast these 3 kingdoms. You have a Venn diagram something like this on your vocabulary sheet. Let's start with traits that are unique to the domain and kingdom Archaea. Archaea are in the domain Archaea. They live in extreme environments and include the groups thermophiles, halophiles, and methanogens. They are possibly the link to life on other planets and to Earth's past. They are the daredevils of life in that they live in these extreme places, and they can also perform chemosynthesis. Now let's talk about what's unique to bacteria. Bacteria are found in the domain bacteria, and they can be found nearly everywhere on Earth, including in and on your body right this very moment. They can be useful in medicine, scientific research, and in food production, and they include bacteria shapes cocci, bacilli, and spirilla. Now let's talk about what's unique to the kingdom Protista. Protists are in the domain eukarya, which means that they have eukaryotic cells. That means their cells have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. They live in or near water and can be multicellular, though most of them are unicellular. They include our plant-like protists, red, green, and brown algae, diatoms, dinoflagellates, and euglenoids, our fungus-like protists, water molds and slime molds, and our animal-like protists, ciliates, flagellates, amoeba-like protists, and spore-producing protists. Now let's talk about the overlap between Archaea and bacteria. Archaea and bacteria are both prokaryotic, which means that they have no nucleus and no membrane-bound organelles. They are always unicellular and are some of our earliest life forms. Some of them even live in your digestive tract. Now let's talk about the overlap between bacteria and protists. Some species of both bacteria and protists can photosynthesize. Another similarity between these 2 kingdoms is that some species can be pathogenic, which means that they can cause diseases. Now let's talk about the overlap between Archaea and Protista. The kingdoms Archaea and Protista are both less familiar to non-scientists, but we know today that they are their own unique life forms. Now let's talk about the similarities between all 3 of these kingdoms of life. All 3 of these kingdoms of life have the 4 basic needs of all living things. They all need food, they all need water, they all need some kind of air, though not all of them need oxygen, and they all need some kind of living space, albeit a very small living space. They also all display the 6 characteristics of all living things. They're made of cells, or maybe just one cell. They respond to stimuli, they reproduce, they contain DNA, they obtain and use energy, and they grow and develop. They can also all take on the roles, depending on the species, of producer, consumer, or decomposer. Additionally, all of these kingdoms contain some, if not all, unicellular species. Now's the part where I'm going to review everything
really fast. Our prokaryotic kingdoms of life, which means they don't have a nucleus, are Archaea and bacteria. Our 3 kinds of Archaea are methanogens, which make methane, halophiles, which live in salty places, and thermophiles, which live in hot places. Our three main shapes of bacteria are bacilli, which are rod-like, spirilla, which are spiral-shaped, and cocci, which are round. Our eukaryotic kingdom that we talked about, which means the cells contain a nucleus, is the kingdom Protista. Protista contains fungus-like, plant-like, and animal-like organisms. Our fungus-like protists include slime molds and water molds. Our plant-like protists include green algae, red algae, brown algae, diatoms, euglenoids, and dinoflagellates. Our animal-like protists include flagellates, ciliates, amoeba-like protists, and spore-producing protists. Flagellates move using the flagella, amoeba-like use the pseudopod, and ciliates use cilia. Because spore-producing protists are all parasites, they do not move on their own.